Everybody has to fight their congressman and say, look, we're not going to spend.
That's what concerns me. That's what concerns me.
Okay, Robert, you're a soul, and in 24 hours, you're going to be born into a body. What type of world are you going to construct?
Life, liberty, property, and leave people alone, basically.
Basically, you have to extract some money to supply the infrastructure so the society can work. The current tax system that we have is very inefficient.
The preservation or optimization of individual freedom, in my opinion, seems to be at odds with taxation itself.
You know, I hear you, big guy. But there's a couple of things you got to think about in terms of the position we're in.
I mean, this is like the mafiosos collecting their protection racket money. How is that different than what we have today?
Today, our debt to GDP ratio is 120%.
And rising fast.
And so you have to ask yourself, what happened between 1945 and 2024?
So can we talk about the role of money printing in the expansion of wealth inequality and government indebtedness?
Well,
so you've written a book titled Disrupting Taxes, Applying Technology and Science to the Tax System and Reigniting the American Dream. Subtitle, Exploring the Forgotten Stories of Taxes, Gold, and Money. Obviously a very relevant topic for this show, so I've got a lot of questions for you.
hey, Robert, let me start by saying it's great to be here.
Yeah.
You and your team, you guys are doing some very fascinating work.
Thank you.
And I'm excited to be part of the conversation.
Well, I'm excited to have you. This is a topic we obviously touch on a lot. The history and nature of taxation is very closely bound up with the history and nature of money, clearly.
Right.
And we also really like to focus on definitions in this show because we tried to be first principle thinkers and conversationalists. So I think it would be appropriate for us to just start with a definition of taxation. And yeah, let's just start there. And I want to ask you some more details about it.
Sure. Well, I, from my view, and in the book, there's a little bit of a discussion about a thought experiment that basically takes the Carnot efficiency test out of physics and applies it to a tax system.
Oh, what is that test? What is that Carnot efficiency test?
The Carnot efficiency is the efficiency of an engine.
Okay.
So you can test the efficiency of any engine, whether it's a gas engine or a steam engine or a nuclear engine. And those principles of physics, if you do it in a consistent manner across the principles, you can. We as a thought experiment, we apply it to a tax system.
So this is a conversion rate of like thermal energy to mechanical energy, something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
And so when you think about taxation, okay, what we have to do is extract some piece of money out of the economy. And when we extract that money out of the economy, what'll happen is that money will then be used to provide the infrastructure so that the society can function. And there could be a lot of debate as to how much infrastructure or how little infrastructure.
Sure.
And in fact, before the end of our discussion, we ultimately, and I tell the story in the book of a thought experiment that the legal philosopher John Rawls called the original position behind the veil of ignorance. And we could talk about that. But so basically you have to extract some money to supply the infrastructure so the society can work. And the current tax system that we have is a self-declaratory income tax and corporate tax system. And that system is very inefficient in my view. And so how do we create a tax system that can be really fair and equitable?
Okay. So defining tax then as the extraction of purchasing power from free market actors by the state for purposes of providing infrastructure, security, social programs, etc.
No, exactly. In fact, if you go back to the Constitution, there are 6 stated goals in the Constitution and the preamble, which are: we the people, in order to provide or form a more perfect union,
Mm-hmm.
establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the common defense, promote the general welfare,
Mm-hmm.
and secure the blessings of liberty.
Mm.
So those are the goals
Mm-hmm.
for our constitutional republic.
That's very ephemeral, all of those stated objectives. I mean, you can start to, it's like, it sounds great. And a lot of
Right.
these
No, it's
notions
true.
sound great, right? Even
Right.
the Marxist notion of from each according to their ability to each according to their need sounds
Right.
wonderful, but in
Right.
practice, it's horrendous.
Right.
So how do those very ephemeral general notions translate mechanically into what the government should be doing, in your opinion?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that, so, in thinking about first principles,
Mm-hmm.
ask yourself, what's the first principle of the Constitution?
Mm-hmm.
And so, some on the left would say, oh, the first principle of the Constitution is to redistribute wealth. I don't think that's anywhere in the document. I don't think you can
Mm-hmm.
find it there.
Mm-hmm.
Those on the right would say, well, the first principle is to maximize individual freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really where the founding fathers were.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And so how do you interpret along the way, as you've just said, there's a lot of movement in there for a different, perspective.
Mm.
I think generally speaking, less government is better.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to have a larger sort of view of the entirety of the system, but generally speaking, less government is better. And how do we extract enough money from the general economy to provide the institutions, the minimal institutions that allow all of us to pursue our own individual freedoms?
Yeah. And so that for me is the crux of the conflict, I think, is I agree that the U.S. Constitution is intended to optimize individual freedom. Right? We inherited the legacy from the Magna Carta, which was life, liberty, inviolable private property. We converted that into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I think was a dreadful mistake. But again, you shifted something that was very concrete, inviolable private property, very legally defined and tight, to something ephemeral, right? The pursuit of happiness. And that opens up a lot of room for demagoguery and all this nonsense.
Gotcha.
So the preservation or optimization of individual freedom, in my opinion, seems to be at odds with taxation itself, because taxation involves a non-consensual exchange of purchasing power from an individual to the state.
Right.
And so consent is really this line that we circle philosophically about taxation. It's like, if it were consensual, right? If you could opt out or negotiate at least, right? Just like you negotiate the price with anything that you buy in this world, then it wouldn't even be taxation at that point. It would be some type of like security fee.
Right.
But when the security provider uses the means of defense, weapons, legal coercion, et cetera, to impose the rate, the non-negotiable rate that's extracted unilaterally, that's the problem, right? You're now, it's anti-constitutional. It's not constitutional, actually. That's why we didn't have the income tax until after the inception of the Fed and World War I and all of these things. So,
right. Well, as you know, so you're right. So early on, there was a lot of confusion about taxation. Under the Articles of Confederation, we as a country, the 13 original colonies that signed onto the Articles of Confederation, they didn't allow for any taxation, really. And in fact, the way it was worked is that if the federal government had a bill, they would send that bill to each state as a ratio of their percentage of the population. The problem was that when the federal government under the Articles of Confederation sent the bill to the states, the story is told that they basically paid 23%. Or 23 cents on a dollar. And the government just couldn't function. And so they went back to the drawing table and wrote the Constitution, and everybody signed on. But even that Constitution was very confusing in its early stages. What was direct taxation? What was indirect taxation?
Right.
What was allowed? And that's why, taxation at the end of the day is really a function of what's mechanically possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why for the first 70 years as a country, we collected all our taxes through tariffs at the borders,
right.
At the harbors.
Right, which makes sense if you consider that the purpose of central government is to secure those borders effectively from foreign invaders. Well, then maybe they should be the gatekeepers and take a fee for goods crossing those borders. But then then that should be it, basically, right? It's like you secure the border, you collect your fee at the border. That's all you do.
Right.
That's even what I think the Trump administration is flirting with the idea, right? Abolishing the income tax and going back to a tariff.
And the problem there is that tariffs historically are more burdensome on the poor, which is an issue. And the other real problem in my mind is that the tax base for tariffs is only $7 trillion. So if you got a $6 trillion budget, how are you going to extract $6 trillion from 7?
What is that based on, the $7 trillion?
I've read some economists out there are saying that based on the amount of trade that comes in and out of the country.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So the taxable economic flows
is $7 trillion.
Okay.
And in the book,
well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe then the government doesn't, $6 trillion budget is 6 times more than we need, 10 times more than we need. And the government needs to shrink accordingly.
Right. And
we go back to, 10% flat tax on the $7 trillion. You're at $700 billion is the total government budget rather than $6 trillion.
Yeah. Well, but I hear you. I hear you, big guy. But there's a couple of things you got to think about in terms of the position we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, we have $35 trillion deficit as we speak.
Yeah.
And we can talk about how we got there.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, of that $35 trillion, when you look at each annual, so 2024, we spent $6 trillion. There's $1 trillion in interest payments.
Mm-hmm.
There's $1 trillion in military.
Mm-hmm.
That can't be touched. There's $1 trillion. Well, I say it can't be trusted politically.
Politically, yes, but economics trumps politics.
Right. I got you. I got you. But just in the reality of what, next year, the new Congress is going to have to pass a tax act because the Tax Cut and Jobs Act expires at the end of 2025. So there's going to be a lot of discussion over the next 6 months about what they will pass. If you go back, okay, Medicare is $1 trillion, Social Security is $1.4 trillion. If that's the case, how are you going to cut significantly the other $2.5 trillion that's left? You're in a pickle. And so from my view, it's, hey, we're in this pickle. How are we going to extract, even for a temporary level, how are we going to extract $6 trillion from the economy? And it's a challenge. And I think the current self-declared taxation of individuals and corporations it's asking for trouble.
Sure.
It's always been asking for trouble.
No, I agree with that. Highly inefficient and frankly, just impossible to comply with. Like when you actually get into the tax code, it's literally impossible to comply. You comply one rule, then you're contravening other rules, and it's just an utter nightmare.
Absolutely true. Yeah. And as you really think about the tax code is in the current reality that we're in, the code is not only ineffective and inequitable, but it's replete with political exemptions that are unfair.
Right.
So, if you step back and you say, hey, how are we going to look at this from, the 10,000-foot level? The reality of where we're in, not philosophically where we might want to be, but the reality of where we're in, if you step back and look, number one, we have 2 sources of revenue for the federal government. We have the possibility of collecting taxes from individuals and their salaries and income, and taxes on corporations and their profits.
And money printing.
We could talk about borrowing and money printing in a minute.
Definitely another source of revenue because that's how they deficit spend.
No, we can absolutely talk about that. And that's a that's a big concern.
Yeah.
But if you just look at taxing and
Yeah,
how
two forms of direct tax are individual or corporate, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, Robert. Sort of in my own polling, just asking friends and family and strangers on the street. If you ask a stranger on the street, hey, what percentage of our current revenue comes from taxes on corporations, and what percentage of our current revenue comes from taxes on individuals?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, people will say, oh, I don't know, corporations are maybe 50%, 60%, 75%, but it's completely inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations are 10% of our revenue, and the taxes on individuals and their salary is 90%.
In the U.S.
In the U.S.,
yeah.
And the burden is on the middle class and the upper middle class salary guy.
Yeah. So I don't want to stop, but
sure,
we're jumping ahead a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I want to build up towards that, if that's
okay
with you. Unless there's a point you wanted to finish on that, I don't want to interrupt.
No.
Okay.
I think we're going to get to it. It's just that the over time there's been this big shift of the burden onto, and that shifting has other unintended consequences.
Right. Okay, so still on the definition of taxation. It sounds like we have slightly varying definitions. I want to ask you about the nature of consent and how it applies to taxation. Can taxation be consensual? Is taxation consensual? What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think that under the notions of citizenship, right? It's consensual in that you consent as a citizen to be taxed.
Well, what about the exit tax though? Because if you don't consent to be a citizen and you want to move your capital offshore, if anything above $2 million gets taxed.
Well, yeah. Let me think about that. I'm not sure. I think that it is true. Look, we're in an international world, and many people do, they change citizenships and they move, to other locations for very good reasons. And many of them are tax-based. So, I mean, you're too young to remember, but I remember when the Swedish tennis player Bjorn Borg moved from Sweden to Switzerland because of the tax base. There's many examples like that in the world.
Yeah. So okay, then you think it's consensual, but maybe there's aspects of it that are not consensual.
Yeah, I have to reflect on that.
Okay.
Yeah, let me reflect on that.
Okay, very good.
The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code BREEDLOVE for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality.
Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLF, NYC.com. You brought up Adam Smith's vision of fair taxation. Obviously, Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, a founding figure in economics, basically, broadly.
Right.
He's not a Keynesian economist. He's more of a traditional classical economist. I don't know if people would call him an Austrian economist per se.
Well, I mean, I think of him as a real sort of the father of the free market. You know, he believes that in the private contractual relationship, the invisible hand will advance society.
Yes.
And so, but
and the invisible hand is basically what converts individual self-interest into collective.
Yeah, that there's a good. Exactly. That's exactly right. There's a good.
The baker does not bake his bread out of the kindness of his heart, but out of his own self-interest.
Brilliant.
Like that.
Brilliant recollection. That's exactly right. And Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, hey, all taxes have to have these 4 principles. The first is it must be proportional.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that deeply, what does proportional mean? It basically means it has to be the same for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So in the book, I talk about, when we'll get to it, a transaction tax where everybody, is taxed the same at 1%.
Mm-hmm.
But think about today. Well, we have progressive taxes, and they're not proportional.
Mm-hmm.
Some guys are paying 0, some guys are paying 20%, some guys are paying 40%.
Mm-hmm.
It's an inequitable notion in my view, and it's not effective. So beyond taxes being proportional, they have to be predictable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think taxes are not predictable under the current code. They're constantly moving and changing. And so it's very hard, whether it's a corporation or an individual, to plan
Mm-hmm.
your taxes in a predictable way. And we need to find a system that is predictable. And then they have to be 2 things. 1, easy to collect, and easy for the taxpayer to pay. And so those are Smith's 4 principles, and I think that they make a lot of sense, and we should apply them to our code.
You said something earlier too, because the third aspect there was collectability, and you said that ultimately taxation boiled down to collectability.
That's correct, right? So if you think about, and you can go back throughout history, but in the States, there was no real way to collect taxes at the founding fathers.
Mm-hmm.
The easiest mechanical mechanism to collect taxes was at the harbors.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's a story where Julius Caesar wanted to institute a 1% tax, in essence, a 1% sales tax, but he was unable to collect it.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, he had to shift his whole tax structure, and it became, there are stories in history that say, what he did is he got so desperate to collect revenue that he would subcontract out the tax collection to a regional governor who would pay it all to Caesar, and then that guy would go out amongst his people and collect it, and he would collect it plus a handsome commission for himself. So, but the notion was good from a perspective of a 1% tax. It's probably a fair and equitable tax, but can it be collected? And in fact, on the collected issue, you ask yourself, why do we have withholding tax from salary today?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer, interestingly enough, goes back to the famous free market economist Milton Friedman. So he was a young economist at the Treasury Department in 1943, and they were saying, how can we collect tax? And he was part of a working group that said, well, we can reach out and get Congress to pass an act, and we can reach out and attach the salaries and make them pay an estimated tax on what you will ultimately owe at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And hence, that's why we have withholding today.
Yeah, well, it just makes it more economically efficient, right? If you just collect it at the source rather than trying to collect it after the fact. So,
right.
Yeah, so those tax collectors of old, I mean, this is like the mafiosos collecting their protection racket money, right? You go door to door and you say, hey, pay up.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, pay up for what?
Right.
Pay up for what I'm going to do to you if you don't pay up.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right.
And so, yeah, the certain individuals would be deputized by the king or whoever the ruling authority may be, and then they would go out and collect taxes, but they would collect more than they would remit to the king, and they would keep the difference.
Right.
So, I mean, what we're talking about is it's protection racket or tribute,
right?
To use another term. So, like, how has that changed? Like, if that's the origin of taxation, how is that different than what we have today?
Well, structurally, it's different, right? Because we now have a tax system which has shifted quite a bit, even from 1945. So if you think about the tax system and you think about the percentage of allocation, so if today corporations are paying only 10% and individuals are paying 90%, it was not always that way.
Sure.
Right? In the US in 1945, that percentage was equal. Corporations were contributing 40% and individuals were contributing 40%. And the other thing that's really interesting at that point, in 1945, our debt to GDP ratio was 102%. And that was the highest debt to GDP ratio in the history of the country.
Right.
Today, our debt to GDP ratio is 120%.
Yeah.
Now it's the highest.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's frightening and
rising fast.
Yeah. Right? And so you have to ask yourself, well, what happened between 1945 and 2024?
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things in there. Number one, when the burden was shared between individuals and corporations, that ratio went down. So much so that when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, the debt to GDP ratio was only 30%. But we had some economic doldrums. Reagan was looking for a way to stimulate the economy, and he passed the big tax cut. And what happened is they sort of believed in trickle-down economics, but it really didn't turn out to be true. And so within 8 years, by the time Reagan left office, the debt to GDP ratio was 60%. And there's a great story where a journalist at the end of Reagan's term said to Reagan, "Mr. President, do you have any regrets?" And he thought for a moment and he said, "Yeah, the national debt." So he knew that it was a real issue. And then from there, it went on, meaning there were Democratic and Republican tax cuts. The latest was the Tax Cuts and Job Act, and everybody's contributed to the deficit. But what's really also interesting is that slow shift of the burden, where it was equal, now it's all on the salaried worker. And the amount of loopholes that are available to the wealthy and to the corporations and have made that burden inequitable.
Yeah, so the other major thing that happened between 1945 and 2024 is the 1971 Nixon shock, where he removed the dollar from the gold standard.
That's a
So can we talk about the role of money printing in the expansion of wealth inequality and government indebtedness?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, it's in the book where what had happened is, as you know, there was, after World War II, there was the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And that agreement allowed for a gold exchange window
Mm-hmm.
so that in the balance of trade, a nation, though you couldn't turn your dollar in for gold as a citizen,
Yeah.
but France, if they had an excess number of dollars, they could turn those dollars in and get gold.
Right.
And so as we know, the gold was leaving, and Nixon closed the window
Mm-hmm.
and put us on a fiat currency, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, and the gold was leaving because we were expanding the U.S. dollar supply faster than our gold reserves. So we're increasingly running a fractional reserve. I think by 1971, we had 6-1, like 6x more USD outstanding than we had at gold in reserve. That's why people were redeeming their dollars for gold.
Well, that and compounded on that interest, we had been fighting the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
We had sent a lot of money abroad.
Yeah, well, of course. These things
Right?
all go hand in hand. When you can print money out of thin air, it's
Right.
easy to go to war. It's easy to send it abroad.
No,
Yeah.
that's very true. No. Those are the current how shall I say, handicaps of a fiat currency.
Right. Okay. So is inflation taxation?
Well, yes, in some ways, and in fact, the reason the government tries to not allow inflation to be an effective increase of taxation, and the way they do that is every year they make the inflation adjustment to the tax brackets, so that in theory, even though there's inflation, you don't pay more taxes under the code.
Based on CPI, which is not inflation. Yeah.
But you get the idea.
Yeah. I mean, I get the idea, but I think it's a total, utter farce. Like you say, you're making an inflation adjustment to protect the consumer, but the inflation adjustment's based on a metric that's completely falsified. Like, we increased your Social Security payout 2% for inflation this year. It's like, well, the price of beef is up 80% in the same time period.
Right.
It's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. So inflation is taxation. It's not there's no actual recompense for it. I mean, if you're paying, even if you get the CPI adjustments, you're not being shielded from it entirely.
Right.
So what's wrong with that? Like if it's not, we're back to the consent thing again, because there's no political process that decides how much money to print and how much inflation to impose on people. So it's a form of taxation, definitely without consent in this case. So what are the problems with money printing?
Well, man, that's out of my bailiwick in some respects. I think money printing is a very challenging. The money supply is a very challenging matrix to manage. I sort of, what my perspective is, look, we take the, we take the situation as we find it. And in sort of in disrupting taxes, my notion is, how can we take the system that we have and just make it a little better? And you're posing a much larger question for a much larger change in the current governmental structure, and so it's a bridge beyond my my sense of understanding.
Yeah. Well, I think Rothbard said incrementalism in theory is perpetuity in practice. So if we don't make radical change, we might just be damned to to keep circling the drain we've been circling here.
Right. And
increasing wealth inequality, increasing indebtedness, increasing warfare abroad, et cetera.
Right.
Someone's got to put some adults in charge.
Right.
What's the role of gold? Why not? Are you an advocate for a gold standard, or how do you?
Well, again, the money supply is a very tricky thing. I think that we're not going to be able to go back to the gold standard. I think the genie's out of the bottle. From my own perspective, I sort of see it as, okay, if fiat currency, if we're going to operate, in my lifetime with fiat currency, how do we make the tax system equitable and fair and effective under, sort of under the current system? And so those were the notions in my mind as we, as we wrote, Disrupting Taxes. And I think that it's that alone is a monumental task. I mean, I would think, and you'd sort of tell me your thoughts, but Congress is going to pass a new tax act next year. My guess is that the Republicans are going to simply extend the Tax Cut and Job Act, and maybe some tinkering around the margins. But if that's the case, does that help, as you say, any of the larger issues, whether it's the wealth gap, whether it's the loss of the American dream? And we can all define the loss of the American dream in different ways. Some people have defined it as, hey, for example, when I was born, I had a 90% chance of earning more than my father. A guy that was born in the year 2000 has less than a 50% chance. So the system has strangled them to a certain degree, and the wealth gap has increased. And I'm not sure what the optimal wealth gap is, but it's a question for it's a question for debate. So let me give you an example, and you tell me what you think. In 1930, the wealth gap, 10% of the U.S. population owned 80% of the wealth. By 1980, at the time of Reagan, 10% of the population had 60% of the wealth. Today, 10% of the population has 80% of the wealth. What has happened in that span of time that the wealth gap oscillated like that, right? And what would be the optimal wealth gap in society?
I mean, I don't think it is up to policymakers or conscious design of any sort. I would lean into Hayek's view of a spontaneous emergent order, right? It's not for us to decide, it's up for the market to decide what the ideal wealth gap is, right? It's not something we need to manage whatsoever. And the thinking behind that is, well, people naturally have a diversity of skill sets and knowledge and luck, like you can't help it when capital, every system skews results. But the beautiful thing about capitalism is that it optimizes conditions by giving people strong private property and contract law and basically letting them keep most of the fruits of their labor. It creates conditions in which innovation is encouraged. And every time we get one guy figures out how to make a refrigerator, for instance, or an airplane, we all benefit from that idea forever. Like standards of living go through the roof as a result of that. So if we want to keep unlocking new innovations that radically enhance the way we live, I think we should have very minimal, like low to no taxation, and very rule of law that basically just preserves private property and does nothing else.
Just on that point, it makes me think. So I've often wondered, why is it that immigration comes to the United States? And foundationally, it's, as you just said, it's rule of law that protects private property. It doesn't allow, in theory, for corruption. And it provides some degree of safety. And I've often wondered, why is it that other countries, say in Latin America or South America, have never been able to put those elements in place? But if those elements could be put into place, people wouldn't want to migrate. And, I sometimes think about, well, could the U.S. export its rule of law?
Export for sure.
Right.
And, which I guess I wanted to ask you about this, which sort of dovetails nicely, is like, well, the reason the U.S. has been as successful as it has been is because of the founding fathers' vision, right? That they founded this country on a tax revolt, basically escaping the tyranny of the Bank of England and the British Empire.
Right.
And they knew the dangers of central banking and centralized governance. So we created a very decentralized governance structure, a constitutional republic in particular.
Right.
There was no central bank. There was no possibility of a central bank, according to our constitutional documents.
Right.
It took 3 attempts to get one in. Right. So in my view, it's the founding fathers' vision of maximizing individual freedom and minimizing the possibility of government overgrowth and corruption that has made the United States such a successful economic story. And I agree. To the degree we can get back to that and export that is the degree to which we can save the world, so to speak.
Sure. And you know what's really interesting on the founding fathers' point is when you think about the Boston Tea Party, you say, oh, okay, we have no taxation without representation. There's actually another side to that, which isn't often told. And that other side is that the rebellion was also because there was this enormous tax loophole. So the story is told that, on the East Coast, all the taverns and inns, they were, selling tea, right? You would go in and get yourself a pot of tea. Well, the British Crown had given its British East Indian Company, owned by the king, a tax exemption on tea. So as a result, all the inns and taverns along the East Coast that were aligned to the king had tea at a much cheaper rate. They were given a loophole, and hence driving up all the taverns and inns that were aligned to the revolution out of business. And so tax loopholes and tax documents have been, it's been a driving force in many ways.
For sure. So what was the founding, that was the question I wanted to get to, is what was the founding fathers' vision of fair taxation?
There was a lot of confusion at the time of the founding fathers. Hamilton believed that you had to have both direct and indirect taxation. But indirect taxation was allowed, tariffs, but the direct taxation on the people was very confusing. And as a result, we went through a lot of changes, and we went through a lot of attempts to get to a place that ultimately ended up in the 16th Amendment. So it's a history that's a bumpy road.
So there was no clear vision from the outset.
From my perspective, no clear vision. And it as a result, that's why we didn't have any income tax. For a long time.
Right. Until the inception of the Fed.
Yeah. Right. And the 16th Amendment.
And so you mentioned the 16th Amendment, and I guess we should ask how the Civil War impacted taxation as well. Could you tell us what is the 16th Amendment? What does it have to do with the story, and how does the Civil War play into it?
Right. So Lincoln had his back against the wall, and he had no money, and he had to pay his troops. And so he called a special session of Congress, and they came in and they passed the Revenue Act of 1861. And it was the first income tax. And he was able to run that for a little bit until it was challenged in the courts. And it was ultimately found to be unconstitutional in that it was considered a direct tax that wasn't apportioned to the states by population. And then there was a lot of confusion from the 1870s into the early 1900s. And all that confusion ultimately resulted in the 16th Amendment, which basically made it very clear you can tax any income from any source at any time. And it was after that that the Fed came into place and income tax, and then progressive income tax, which is a whole nother level of questions from a constitutional standpoint. Is it really constitutional the courts have said it is constitutional to have progressive rates, but
Progressive
maybe that's
meaning,
open to some debate, right?
yeah, the more money you make or the more assets you have, the more highly you're taxed.
Right.
Yeah.
Hence the brackets that go up, right?
Right.
You know.
Okay. Well, I don't want to jump ahead, but I guess I should. I mean, this is the question begs the question actually,
Sure.
because okay, progressive taxation is okay. The more you have, the more you make, the more your tax rate can be. But we don't have that actually, because there are so many loopholes now in the tax code that the super rich are actually taxed at a much lower effective tax rate than the rich or the
Right.
middle class.
That's right.
Even the poor sometimes.
A great
And I think
example.
Warren Buffett, he said something about this, right? Like it doesn't make any sense that Buffett himself was paying a 4% effective tax rate
Right.
or whatever it
That's
was, and his
exactly
secretary is paying 15%.
No, that's exactly right. And
So how did we go from progressive tax, which most people would probably get behind, right? Tax the rich is a pretty
Right.
popular philosophy
right
amongst
but I think it's
populations.
right, but I think it's misguided. I think
I
that,
agree.
you know,
Taxation is
and
misguided.
in the
as far as I'm
book,
concerned.
and we'll get to it, but you know, the proposal is for a banking transaction tax at 1% to everybody. But Buffett is a very interesting guy, and Buffett really, I'm very impressed by Buffett. I sort of like his philosophy, and so the very fundamental premise, as you just said, is if you take, for example, we could talk about loopholes for a long time, but if you take the loopholes around sports franchises, so the owner of a sports franchise is given enormous tax benefits. He's allowed to depreciate and amortization of his purchase in an accelerated way. Just in a round number, you pay $1 billion for a sports team, and you get a 10-year schedule, and that's a fictional loss of $100 million a year. And if you own that team and you have another business on the side, say you're making car parts for Toyota, and you're making $100 million, you get to, on your consolidated return, you get to wash that, and you pay no tax at all. And the guy's, $100 million, to the good.
Yeah.
So it's inequitable that the guy who earns $200,000 a year has no option to get that.
Right.
And it's that disparity that has shifted the burden onto the middle class and created this great divide in today's world that has to be corrected from our view.
In addition to the money printing, which also increases that wealth disparity. So is it then the accelerated amortization and depreciation that's driving this inequality between the super rich and the rich or middle class?
That's a great deal of it, but there's another part of it too. So another loophole, just to give you an example, a loophole that only the wealthy can take advantage of, that the guy who's earning $200,000 a year can't take advantage of, is this notion of invest, borrow, and die. So under the tax code, as you pass your estate to your heirs, you're allowed to step up in basis. So if you invested in any stock, say you invested 20 years ago in NVIDIA, and now it's worth $100 and your basis was $0 or $1, right? You when you die, your heirs get that step up in basis. So what do you do in the interim before you die? What you do is you borrow against that. And there's an exemption, $13 million exemption in the estate currently under the current law. And so what happens is you borrow a couple of $1 million to support your own lifestyle, and then your heirs can sell. They get the step up in basis. They sell the stock. They pay no taxes on it. They pay off the loan, and they go down the road. So that, a guy earning $200,000 a year can't take advantage of that.
Right.
And so that this big disparity in where the code allows for advantage is inequitable. The foundational notion is mathematics and science tell you the wider the tax base, the lower the rate.
Yeah.
And if the base is wide, and the rate is low and everybody pays, it's not a burden on anybody.
Mm-hmm.
The guy making $200,000 a year is not going to be paying 35%.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, to me, the greatest, incentive to say, let's recreate the system. And in the automated banking transaction tax in the book, it says, hey, we're going to just scrape a simple 1% from everybody's banking transaction. And as a result, everybody pays, no exemptions. And that, Robert, that system has many of the same elements that I believe in your thesis is attractive, for example, with Bitcoin, meaning, hey, you have to limit the trustfulness of the institution. So in this case, self-declared tax filings, you're trusting that individual to do it honestly, right? Plato said 2,500 years ago, he said, where there's an income tax, the just man will pay more and the unjust man will pay less on the same amount of income.
And that is so at odds with what Rothbard would say.
As
much as I love Plato, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's, and I'm a big fan of Plato. I think his worldview is quite fascinating. And so the premise of self-declared tax filings is fraught with abuse. And if you can eliminate all of those elements and you can do it in an automated way, you're going to extract whatever amount of money is deemed appropriate in the economy. You're going to extract that money in a way that's fair and equitable.
Interesting. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Before starting the What is Money show, I spent most of my career as a CFO, overseeing internal technology implementations and business acquisitions. Over the next 10 years, it is projected that over 12 million businesses in the U.S. will be sold. If you are an operator running a business generating between $5 and $200 million of revenue, and you're considering selling your business within the next decade, then there is a significant opportunity for you to deploy technology to streamline business processes, reduce operating costs, and enhance the multiple your business ultimately sells for. To this end, I am partnering with the team at Emerge Dynamics, a firm with decades of experience in maximizing the value of privately held small and middle market businesses. Go to emergedynamics.com/breedlove to learn how you can build an attractive, high multiple company that maximizes your return when you fully exit. Again, that's emergedynamics.com/breedlove. This December 17th to 21st, 2024, join me on the Pacific coast of Mexico for our men's retreat, The Art of Alpha. At this world-class retreat center, we will have daily meditations, movement practices, yoga, cold plunging, infrared sauna, and many other biohacking modalities, all while enjoying world-class cuisine designed for optimal full-body health. The retreat center is a gorgeous biohacker's paradise located right on the ocean. You can think of this place as a nervous system reset facility.
At the Art of Alpha, we are seeking men who wish to cultivate freedom, wisdom, sovereignty, physical fitness, truth, and love in themselves and in those who look up to them. If you've always felt motivated to push yourself to new limits to discover the best version of yourself, but you've struggled to find the right community to immerse yourself in, then the Art of Alpha is for you. To apply to join the Art of Alpha, go to breedloveevents.com. Again, that's breedloveevents.com to apply to join us for the Art of Alpha on the Pacific coast of Mexico this December 17th through 21st, 2024. So there was a change, I guess, in taxation in the United States from at the conclusion of World War II, 1945, going forward. Can we talk about what that is? You already mentioned the shift in the tax burden from corporations to individuals. What's taken place in the past 80 years?
Right. So basically, there have been 2 or 3 big tax reform acts. There was the Reagan Tax Reform Act. There was the Bush Tax Reform Act, a little bit under Clinton and Obama, and then the big Trump Tax Reform Act. And all of those acts, some of them, in an attempt to try and stimulate the economy, but all of those tax acts lowered taxes, and in theory, they had hoped to actually increase tax revenue. I don't remember the exact numbers, but fundamentally in 1990, tax collection as a percentage of GDP was roughly 19%. By 2020, tax collection as a percentage of GDP was down to 16%. So it really allowed loopholes to open up, and so in effect, less money was collected, and as we know, governments like to spend money, and more money was spent. Hence, the deficit has grown. And that's why the deficit grew so dramatically under Reagan. And since Reagan has grown dramatically until, where we're at today. And so those changes were slow, and they were whittled away at over time. And we just didn't realize it. I think, upper middle class and middle class Americans just didn't realize that it's on their backs that the vast majority of all the tax revenue is being collected. And so that slow shift has put us in a very difficult position. And, those in power don't want to give up their tax, favorable status. And we have to look for ways, in my opinion, we have to look for ways to effectively extract, pick a number, but let's call it 6 trillion from the economy. And how do we do that?
So end of World War II, I think you said, was an all-time high debt to GDP ratio.
Correct.
At that time, over 100%.
Right.
And it was the burden of that started to be shifted. The tax burden started to be shifted basically to get that to come down, right? You needed to pay the debt.
Well, it did come down.
Yeah.
So what happened is, at that time, they had instituted a shared burden where individuals were contributing 40% and corporations were contributing 40%. And as a result, by the time Reagan took office, the debt to GDP ratio was 30%.
Right.
It was an enormous success from that perspective.
Yeah.
And then other forces were at work. The economy was stumbling. Reagan was prompted to try to juice the economy, and they did it with these tax changes that shifted the burden back. So it's really quite remarkable if you think about history. From 45, we're at 102% of GDP. Reagan was at 30%, and today we're at 120% of GDP. And it's frightening.
So what I wanted to ask was, what is the role of corporate lobbying in shifting the burden away from corporations and onto individuals?
I think it's enormous. I think the corporate lobbying has powerful influence. you can even say that influence has been exacerbated, or it's been turbocharged
Mm-hmm.
because there was a Supreme Court case in Citizens United that basically said unlimited money can be spent lobbying Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, money is powerful,
Mm-hmm.
and it wields great influence. And as a result, those corporate, individuals or corporate, they're corporations, but they're considered individuals under the law.
Mm-hmm.
They have extracted great preferential treatment, and that preferential treatment, again, under the eyes of self-declaratory taxes,
Mm-hmm.
has created this inequity. And mind you, Robert, this is all, everything they do is it's legally provided for, meaning
Mm-hmm.
these loopholes, it's legal tax avoidance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the real issue that we currently face is, how do we extract money? How do we change that? And a solution from my perspective, our perspective, has been the automated banking transaction tax.
Got it. So what is there a solution to reducing the influence of corporate lobbying and reconfiguring tax policy? Is this just a problem we're always going to deal with? I mean, why did this become so pervasive over the past 80 years?
Right. I think the answer is, in part, the unlimited amount of money that's been put into the system.
So the money printing.
No. I was thinking about there are no restrictions on
the spending on lobbying.
Political, right? Lobbying, right?
Got it.
So that, to me, has allowed their influence to become powerful. And
right, if you combine that with the consequence of money printing too, that it's actually making the rich richer and the poor poorer.
Right, it's logarithmically.
Then they also can spend some of that stolen money on more lobbying to further reconfigure the legal structure to favor them and disfavor the poor.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And again, that's why, to me, you have to get away from that whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, from my perspective in disrupting taxes, it says, hey, let's step back and let's widen the tax base, lower the rate, make it automatic, use technology. Just use technology, make it automatic, and let everybody pay proportionately. And then you can have the political fight. Well, maybe we should spend less. You fight that lobby and you spend less. But regardless, you can, in an automated banking transaction tax, you can shift the small amount. If it's 1%, 0.5% on the debit, 0.5% on the credit side of every transaction, you can change that percentage up or down. Maybe it's 0.8%, maybe it's 1.2%, but you can always make it match your budget. You can always make it match, in this case, the money needed to, one, pay off the debt and get to a balanced budget. Two, we're going to need money to keep the Social Security trust fund solvent. People have, in theory, paid into it, and people, in theory, should get their money out of it. So how do we, in the practicalities of today's world, how do we make that happen in a way that's effective and fair for everybody?
So this is a document, well, you prepared, but this is from an essay or article that you wrote, right?
That's actually from the book.
Okay, from the book. Okay.
Yeah.
This is a chart emphasizing the declining American dream. Maybe you could just talk us through what this is, what it means.
So, basically, there are a group of academics who have come to the conclusion that if you define the American dream as the ability to earn more money than your parents, okay, when I was born, I had a 90% chance of earning more money than my parents.
Okay.
If you were born in 1990 or 2000, you have less than a 50% chance of earning more. What are all the parameters at work that do that? And if you look at that and you match the correlation of this declining trend against the increasing trend of the burden on salaried taxes, taxes on individual salaries and income, there's a correlation that's quite compelling. And interestingly enough, that correlation is also there when we look at the graph of debt going from 102% down to 30% and back up to 120%. If you look at why it's gone back up because corporations are not contributing their share.
Right.
If you do a deep dive on the corporate side, the corporations contribute 10% to the federal revenue. Of that 10%, 1%, economists estimate that 1% of all corporations in America contribute that 10%. You step back and you say, well, hey, that means 99% of all corporations are not making any payments.
Wow.
Guys like Warren Buffett recently said, hey, there are 800 major corporations in America. If they paid their tax bill, there wouldn't be a deficit. And they're legally avoiding the taxes. They're legally,
right.
It's
tax avoidance, not tax evasion.
Correct.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. So,
but it's largely through this lobbying mechanism you described earlier,
completely
right?
through the lobbying mechanism, and you can see the examples all across industries.
Yeah.
Whether it's the housing industry, whether it's the oil and gas industry, whether it's the farming industry, whatever the industry is, you're going to find special. I mean, real estate is a great example. So under the code, there's a section called 1031.
Yeah.
Right. So
like kind exchange.
Like kind exchange,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. So you buy a piece of property, you sell it, and you buy another piece of property. You never pay your capital gains tax. You just roll it and defer it,
and keep borrowing against it.
And you borrow against it, and then you eventually get to the to the estate exemption when you die,
which is borrow, invest, die that you mentioned earlier.
That's part of it, for sure. So those correlations just seem so compelling to me that you have to step back and say, how can we reconfigure the system?
Yeah.
Take the system that we have. Okay, maybe we would want to change lots of other things in the system, but just accepting the system where we are today, how do we make a really equitable, compelling tax structure? And that's the future, in my mind, of the automated banking transaction tax, where the base is as wide as it can be, and the rate is low. And again, you have to sort of come to the determination, okay, how are we going to calculate how many banking transactions there are? What's the dollar figure? Well, economists estimate, conservatively, mind you, that there's $600 trillion in banking transactions. And that's it. You're taking the stock market out. Stock market is another 250 trillion of transactions a year. So you're going to allow that to be on its own. But if in terms of just in the economy, and as a result, what happens is everybody pays a little. And when everybody pays, even a drug dealer pays. Drug dealer has to take his money and somehow get it into the economy. When they do that, they're going to do it through the banking system. And the statistics today are pretty clear. Only 4% of all U.S. households are not banked. The unbanked is under 4%. So everybody's going to contribute. Everybody's going to do it on an automatic basis. And, as a result, everybody pays less.
So mechanically, the system you are proposing, which is called Automated Banking Transaction Tax, ABT, mechanically, this is just taking a percentage of every banking transaction so that every time someone sends a wire or an ACH payment or whatever payment, 1% is coming off of that and being remitted to the treasury.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So that's it. That's it. That's the system. And then you do what with the existing tax code? You abolish
it. You abolish the IRS.
Oh, beautiful.
You say no more IRS.
Yeah.
And there are other inherent advantages in abolishing the IRS. As you know, there's there's an incident tax burden on preparation.
Right, of course.
think
All the
about
complexity, all the mind power that goes into navigating
all
and
the
litigating
waste,
that.
right?
Yeah,
All of that.
those guys should go be engineers, like go
Right.
solve a real problem.
No, that's exactly right. So
Yeah.
the IRS is completely eliminated, and it's just an automated system.
Yeah.
And technically, it's 0.5% on each side of the transaction. So if you work for Walmart and you make $100,000 a year,
Mhm.
as Walmart puts that $100,000 into your account, 0.5% is taken as it is debited away from their
sender
account.
and recipient each
Right.
pay 0.5%. Okay.
Each pay half, and then as you, the general manager of Walmart, your bank, you get $100,000 in, you pay 0.5%.
Got it. Okay.
But then you spend that $100,000
yeah. Another
again.
0.5%.
So in effect, you're paying 2%.
So, and you said 600 trillion of banking
Right, 600
transactions. So
trillion.
1% across the whole thing is going to be 6 trillion in government revenue
Correct.
per year, which is about what they're spending now.
Correct.
roughly? Okay. So
And if
that's
they-
how you
if-
got to that number?
That's how we got to the number. And again, if the numbers of transactions are actually larger than that, you can lower that percentage down from 1% to something smaller. For example, there was a U.S. Treasury and Fed report of a year ago, and it's cited in the book, that estimates the total banking transactions at $1,500 trillion of banking transactions. I mean, the truth is, J.P. Morgan Chase is on record saying we process
Yeah.
$8 trillion a day.
Right.
One bank.
Mm.
You do the multiple on that.
Right. This is probably Forex trading too, I would assume, is built into that number.
Could be.
Yeah.
It
They're
could be.
cycling foreign currencies, doing arbitrage and all that, which this presumably would put the brakes on that, right? All of a
Well,
sudden.
I think you parcel it out.
And high frequency trading,
No,
Forex.
you parcel that out. All of that, in other words, in the 600 number is not any of the public traded exchanges.
But that does involve putting money onto and off of exchanges through banks. So how would you silo that?
Right. I think you have to silo it. And to be honest, we have to, really, if this transaction tax were adopted, you'd have to do some really deep analysis. And there are guys historically who have proposed it in the past, and they have suggested the same deep analysis, but you have to find a way to silo it. And to be honest, very similar types of transaction taxes have been tried in the past in Brazil and other Latin American countries, but they were always taxes on top of the existing system. So it was on top of income tax. It was on top of corporate tax. Where in this case, we're saying, hey, we're going to do a broad-based tax of everything, and we're going to eliminate the IRS. And so it's again, under the mathematical science of the widest tax base at the lowest rate is the most proportional and the fairest.
Okay. And then, so how do you prevent in this model the state from just increasing the 1% to 2% to 4% to 8% to 10%?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think you have to be vigilant, right, with your members of Congress, because that's a real concern. I do believe that if you can get your handle on the budget, I do believe if you can get your handle around paying off the national debt, because if you think about the national debt, right, the national debt is a tax, borrow, spend, and as you say, print money scheme. And what is that? That is a leveraging, a mortgaging of your children and your grandchildren's future to artificially support the economy of today. And that we have to stop it. It has to come to an end. And so if honest men in Congress, honest women in Congress can see through, they would not, as you suggest, just keep increasing the number so that we just, have governmental spending out of control.
Yeah.
Government spending has to be, as we've talked about, less government is better government. It's a question of balance. You have to, as Warren Buffett says, you have to offer enough services. We're a nation of abundance, and we need to offer enough services to be fair and equitable to all.
High frequency trading on Wall Street, is that?
I think that's siloed out.
You're siloing that out too.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other externalities you've considered about switching to the system that?
Well, my own instinct is that you could switch to the system. Again, it would take real, a sort of a deep analysis, but I think you could do it in a transition of, say, 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't, in the marketplace of ideas, this idea is out there just hoping it can get some traction, right? If it gets some traction, I think we're smart enough to figure out how to make the transition. I also believe that enough people understand and are tired of the IRS that they would see it as a fair and equitable solution.
Why not, if you're trying to, what I'm seeing here is you've identified current government budget spending, right? And you're backing into a tax structure that supports that without all the complexity, right? So you're saying 600 trillion in bank transactions, charge 1%, bam, you've got 6 trillion a year, abolish the IRS, abolish the tax code, free up all that cognitive bandwidth to go and solve some real problems in the real economy.
Correct.
Why not also abolish the Fed in the same token? Like that's just adding additional tax revenue to the government. So, in the interest of simplicity, why not just abolish the Fed too when you abolish the IRS?
No, it's an interesting point. I think I think in the current political environment, it's a bridge too far in my lifetime. And so
we got Senator, is it Massey, right? He's already put out legislation saying to abolish the Fed. Yeah.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
As I was mentioning to you, I'm a fan of the German, von Bismarck, who said, politics is the art of the possible. And so it's sort of that perspective.
So you think it's outside the realm of possibility for now?
Yeah, in my lifetime. Maybe not in yours, but in mine.
I gotcha. So, but would you, if you were looking beyond your own lifetime as like kind of a stretch goal, would abolition of the Fed be consistent with this plan?
You raise, and again, it's not my wheelhouse to understand sort of the premises of an independent currency like Bitcoin. But intellectually, as I start to think about it, I think there's a lot of merit to, all those elements that you're outlining. And as we've said, there are these similar structures to a structure of Bitcoin and the ABT tax. So, Bitcoin, as you say, you want to minimize the need to trust other people.
Yeah. Trust math, not people.
Trust math, not people. Well, the same thing is true with the ABT tax.
Right.
We're trusting the technology and the math, not the people.
Right.
And also with Bitcoin, you're saying, let's take out the politics.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true with the ABT tax. The politics of the loopholes is all gone.
Right.
So in those ways, they're quite similar. And so if, I could tell you a story of, Warren Buffett tells the story of the ovarian lottery. You may be familiar with it. I'll offer it to you. So this fellow, John Rawls, he wrote a very interesting book called Theory of Justice. And Rawls had a thought experiment that said,
book I know.
You know that book,
yeah.
right?
I've read some of it. Not all of it. Yeah.
So in that book, there's a thought experiment that says, in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, let's offer a proposition. And Warren Buffett, he offers the proposition in what he calls the ovarian lottery. And the way Buffett articulates it is he says, okay, imagine that you are a soul and you're going to be born into a new life. And so if you're a Christian, you would say, okay, you're a soul, maybe you're in heaven. If you're a Buddhist, you would say you're a soul in the bardo, which is that place between. If you follow Plato, you're a soul crossing the river of forgetfulness. And what Buffett would say is, he would say, okay, Robert, you're a soul, and in 24 hours, you're going to be born into a body. And I'm going to offer you a remarkable possibility. In 24 hours, when you're born into this body, I am going to allow you, Robert, to construct the entire world that you will live in. You can construct what the government's going to be like. You can construct what the marketplace is going to be like. You can construct what the currency might be like. And we know what you'll select there. You'll construct what the tax system would be like. You'll construct all the elements of the institution of this society. And the elements that you choose are going to be there for your lifetime, for your children's lifetime, and for your grandchildren's lifetime. So in 24 hours, when you are born into that world, it's going to be the world you construct. And what Buffett would say, so in these stories, some, depending on your philosophical viewpoint, maybe you say it's a genie story, maybe you say it's a God story. What's the catch? And the genie would say, well, the catch is this. The world that you're going to be born into, here are the realities. You don't know. Are you going to be male or female? You don't know. Are you going to be rich or poor? You don't know. Are you going to be black or white, Asian or Latin? You don't know. Are you going to be tall or short? Are you going to have a high IQ or a low IQ? Are you going to be physically abled or physically deformed? Are you going to be born in the United States? You're going to be born in Afghanistan. Maybe you'll be born in Africa. Maybe you'll be born in the mountains of Asia. So with that parameter, what type of world are you going to construct so that your life, however the lottery ticket is that you get, maybe you get the good ticket and you're smart and you're strong and you're able-bodied. Maybe you don't get the good ticket. Maybe you get the arduous ticket. How are you going to construct a society that takes care of everybody? And that's what Buffett says. That's how you should look at social economic policy. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think there's a lot of ways to say, okay, what are we going to do? What kind of a system are we going to put in place where there's equal opportunity, where there's a real meritocracy, where there's a real opportunity for, each individual who's willing to do the work to, maximize their lives.
Yeah, it's a good thought experiment. And the very simplistic view, which actually presupposes, like, when we say, oh, maybe you're born in the United States or here or there, it's like, well, then you're not actually constructing the world from scratch. In that case, you're sort of inheriting the existing nation state structures.
Right.
I think if you're actually constructing it from scratch, you would just want absolute equality in the eyes of the law.
Right.
Right. Inviolable law, right? That grounds out completely and totally in the preservation of life, liberty, and property and does nothing else.
Right. That's a great point.
That's the libertarian ideal in a nutshell, if I may be so presumptuous to say it like that. And that's where Bitcoin is such a radical technology, because that's an ideal, right? We've had that ideal. We've scribbled it down on pieces of paper called constitutional documents, and we've tried to adhere to it. However, we have the U.S. Constitution that is the letter of that spirit, but that spirit and letter ultimately get violated by the implementation of something like the Fed.
Right.
Whereas Bitcoin fundamentally is that, right? Like we are all actually equal in the eyes of Bitcoin in a way that no human institution can corrupt or change. So it's like a very firm implementation of the ancient ideal of equality in the eyes of the law.
Right.
And so that's not a complete answer to your question, but like for me, that's
sure,
life, liberty, property, and leave people alone, basically.
Right. Right. And no, it's a great point. And if you really look out into the future with respect to, the ideas of the theory of Bitcoin and its current practical implications, it raises a lot of questions. And how would you, I've got to reflect on it, but it's food for great thought.
Yeah. I want to ask you, so obviously you're proposing a radical change to the tax structure. I want to ask you about how taxes incentivize and disincentivize certain behaviors, and what behaviors do you think the switch to ABT, what behaviors would you expect to see incentivize and disincentivize under this framework?
So reflecting on that, one, if you believe you're a free market guy, I'm a free market guy.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in the free market. And I believe that the free market will create the highest and best utility for all.
Mm-hmm.
And if you believe in the free market, then the most proportionate tax without the burdens of either loopholes or self-declaratory compliance and all of those elements that artificially drive certain segments of the economy, just as we talked about. Okay, these loopholes artificially drive real estate, right? But if you believe in the free market, as I do, this structure is benign to everything in the free market. And so the free market will seek its own level on all elements, because there are no influences coming in to artificially support any particular notion. And as you know, that's true not only with loopholes, but with credits too. So are we going to artificially support certain parts of the economy by giving certain credits? Where I would argue, let's make the collection side of revenue to run government completely neutral. And if you want to support something, support it on the spending side of the equation.
This would presumably be opt-in, opt-out?
No, it would be...
It's compulsory.
Compulsory to everybody.
Okay, but if someone doesn't like the price they're paying for the level of service they're receiving, can they then leave the United States without the exit tax?
Sure. So
so it is opt-out.
Yeah. Opt-out in that respect.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
Okay, but compulsory if you're a U.S. citizen.
Compulsory and it would be compulsory to any bank inside the territory of the United States.
Okay, so that's a good subtle distinction then. Can U.S. citizens own foreign bank accounts and circumvent this tax? Or is it still territorial like the current U.S. tax system?
No, I think they could, but I also believe, there's that notion that the lower the tax rate, the less the incentive is to circumvent the taxes. So it is true if somebody has money outside the United States, that would not be taxed, except if they had an account in the United States and the money comes into the United States, that 0.5% would be in play. And then as they deploy that money within the United States, it would be in play.
Right.
So it again, my own instinct is that when the rate is so low, the incentive to try to avoid tax is very low.
So one of the behaviors I think this would disincentivize, obviously, is the frequent movement of money, because you're going to be paying a skim every time you move the money, right? So under a current system, you might move money back and forth via ACH or whatever free transaction method there is, but under this system, you wouldn't do that because you're getting banged 50 basis points at every transaction.
Out of each transaction.
And if you're on both sides of the trade, you're getting banged at the 100 basis points.
But if you were, I think it would be siloed out. If you were the person, if you were moving money to yourself, you'd be siloed out.
Oh, okay. So what does that mean? Then no, it doesn't apply if it's from an account you own to an account you own.
Correct.
Doesn't that get very messy when you own like 75% of a corporation and you're moving it to a corporation you own 55%
no,
of?
a corporation would be a different entity in my mind. Okay.
So you're saying just personal account to personal account?
Yeah, if it was personal account to personal account.
Okay.
And again, this is such a deep conceptual notion.
Mm-hmm.
I think we would have to really, make a deep analysis to come to the understandings of how it would work on a deep implementation. I believe foundationally, it's conceptually such a profound idea that if you can buy into that, you'll work out the small differences.
And then what would this do to that, where we said on the existing tax scheme, 90% of the burden is being borne by individuals, 10% is being borne by corporations. What would this do to that?
I think it would make it equal. I think you would.
It would just make it 50-50 approximately?
Approximately. Think of it this way. And the GDP is a very challenging number. And I think economists, have a difference of opinion about GDP. But fundamentally, today's GDP is about $27 trillion. And the payroll is about $13 trillion. So, simple math would tell you it probably would come out to be fairly equal.
Gotcha.
In terms of the, contribution across the board.
But there would be no policy adjustment to try and make, like, you wouldn't say it came out 80-20, right? Individuals, corporations. Would you then modify this to try to make it 50-50, or you just leave it?
Just leave it.
Okay.
Right.
Because the simplicity is part of the feature.
Simplicity is part of the feature, right? And again, you want it to be so low. The real key is, hey, what's the largest tax base possible? Yeah. And if you can get the largest tax base possible, then you can have the lowest rate. Yeah. And everybody's happy,
Okay. In closing, maybe you could just paint us a picture of what you think the world would look like on this ABT system. Like, presumably it would be an improvement. All right. We already mentioned doing away with a lot of the complexity and unlocking a lot of this cognitive labor to stop navigating an unnecessarily complex tax code and then go solve some real problems in the real economy. Like, what do you think the world would look like? What are the positive externalities of your proposal?
Right. Well, and you've mentioned a lot of them. One, think of all the unlocked potential that's being wrapped up in trying to comply and modify the tax code, right? So all of that, as you say, maybe somebody goes off and invents, the next, iPhone. Yeah. That's number one. Number two, I would say that when you look at the simplicity of this and you look at how the government collects money, what'll happen, I believe, is that you become very laser focused on what is our government. In other words, this system allows us to collect revenue in a way that matches our spending so that we have a balanced budget. I think this type of a system is a predicate to a national balanced budget amendment that says we're going to have a balanced budget. And because it's pure math, right? And then what'll happen is all of us will have a much more focused perspective on what are we doing on the spending side of the equation. And we can always move the percentage to match the spending side. So if
that's
spending
what concerns me. That's what concerns me.
So if we spend less, we can collect less.
And if we spend more,
but we can always fight it on the spending side so that, okay, we're only going to spend so much. And because we only spend so much, I realize, look, but everybody has to fight their congressman and say, look, we're not going to spend. This is what we're
and then
do.
This is where I think you have to abolish the Fed too, because if they get fought on the spending side and they get locked up, they're like, all right, we'll just print the money then.
Right.
Just print the difference. That's what they've been doing up until this point anyways.
Right. No. And and as you know, that's the source of many of the problems we currently have. Yeah. So I think that I think the ABT tax does free up the American people to simply focus on how much government do we have, and let's fight to keep it at a level we feel comfortable with.
Well, that sounds like a more beautiful world, and I think a great place to bring it to a close. So again, the book is Disrupting Taxes. I think it's obviously a much simpler solution than we currently have. The current solution, I don't even think it qualifies as a solution. It is just a problem, basically.
I'm with you.
And any step away from that towards something like this is definitely an improvement for human freedom, innovation, standards of living, all of those wonderful market-driven things. Thank you so much for joining me in Miami.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to have a conversation with you and your team.
Yeah.
You guys are doing great work, and I look forward to watching in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.